Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the B20 Saudi Arabia Summit, Transforming for Inclusive Growth. My name is Wa'am al-Dakhil, and I will be serving as the Master of Ceremonies during the summit. I would like to begin by thanking the B20 leadership, including the B20 Chair, Mr. Yusuf Al-Banyan, and B20 Sherba, Dr. Abdul Wahab Al-Sadoun, for convening this event. I would also like to thank, on behalf of the custodian of the two holy mosques, King Salman ibn Abdul Aziz Al Saud, the Saudi Minister of Investment, His Excellency Khalid Al Faleh, for joining us today. We have a very exciting agenda split between 2 days. You can follow the conversation of our session on Twitter at B20 and also participate in the discussion by using the hashtag B20 Summit. And now, please turn your attention to the stage for a brief video presentation.
إن علينا جميعا مسؤولية العمل معا والتعاون مع شركائنا في العالم لخلق بيئة يزدهر فيها العالم بما يعزز زيادة حجم وفاعلية الاستثمار في مهارات ووظائف المستقبل، وإنني متفائل أكثر من أي وقت مضى بعزيمة وقدرتنا المشتركة لتحقيق ذلك.
Throughout history, perfect storms of social elements, financial instability, and environmental factors have caused global crises, threatening the economic and social well-being of the world. The Great Depression, the Asian contagion, the financial crisis, and now the COVID-19 pandemic brings economies to a critical point again. Since 1999, the G20 has been a premier forum for economic cooperation. However, business also has a role to play and responsibilities to honor. Since 2010, the B20 has enabled collaboration between global business and policymakers. This year, the world has found itself grappling with unprecedented health and social emergencies. Stalled economies, closed borders, protectionist behavior, and threatened livelihoods. In response, the B20 called upon the G20 to take all necessary measures to fight and minimize damage from COVID-19. The G20 took bold action, committing to do whatever it takes to minimize the economic and social damage. Since the start of its journey, B20 Saudi Arabia set out to create a socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable ecosystem for the world's economies. By leveraging collective effort and multilateral engagement, B20 has played a leading role in uniting the voices of the global business community. 6 task forces and a dedicated Women in Business Action Council have delivered 25 action-oriented, impactful policy recommendations and 69 policy actions aligned with G20 themes. Empowering people by unleashing opportunities for all. Safeguarding the planet by fostering responsible growth and shaping new frontiers through the adoption of technological advances and a culture of integrity. COVID-19 has created opportunities to build back better across the world without losing sight of long-term goals. Now is the time to translate recommendations into action, to bring back responsible growth, to align with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and to build a resilient future for the benefit of all. Welcome to Saudi Arabia and the B20 Summit 2020, transforming for inclusive growth.
Our first guest today is the chair of B20 Saudi Arabia, Mr. Yusuf Al-Banyan. Mr. Al-Banyan is also the vice chairman and CEO of SABIC, one of the world's largest petrochemicals manufacturers, headquartered in Riyadh. So please welcome Mr. Yusuf Al-Banyan.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome the G20 policymakers, global business community, and B20 members, chairs and co-chairs, knowledge and network partners. We are truly grateful for His Majesty King Salman, the custodian of the two holy mosques, for his guidance and support demonstrated by having with us today, his behalf, His Excellency Mohandes Khalid bin Abdulaziz Al-Falih, Investments Minister. I will take this opportunity to briefly present to you the B20 Saudi Arabia recommendations to the G20 and highlight the key initiatives and accomplishment made by the B20 2020 and the legacy we aim to leave behind. The year 2020 will be remembered as the year when the global health, societal, economic, and financial crisis started. The last time when the world went through such a drastic change was around 100 years ago. Governments and central banks acted on an unprecedented base to take measures addressing the potential fallout of this crisis, a lesson that was learned during the global financial crisis a decade ago. However, the measures will not be enough to fully address the structural changes this crisis is inflicting upon us. A lot more must be done by all the actors of the world. And no governments, nor business sector or region single-handedly will be able to repair the damages. This is the time when the need for global cooperation is the highest. We must do everything in our power to ensure global cooperations for resilience and sustainable economic growth for all. Additionally, the G20 must demonstrate an unprecedented level of leadership, collaborations, and engagement across all nations, governments, business, and civil society. Business sector has been at the forefront of global cooperations. For many countries, business has been the driver for global cooperations. The historical trade routes connecting Asia and Europe, Trans-Sahara routes, and other such routes initiated a global trade capital and capital flow and investment and increased business cooperations. B20 Saudi Arabia recognized the important role played by the business it plays amid global challenges. The key challenges of rising income inequality, accelerating climate change, rising protectionism, and accelerating inter-country conflicts related with trade and the geopolitics have been in our agenda since the start of our presidency last year. When the global pandemic hit, the B20 acted promptly by identifying critical issues such as disrupted supply chain, financing support, SMEs, and pressure on healthcare and education infrastructures, and provided key action-oriented recommendations to the G20 to address these pressing issues. B20 Saudi Arabia is led by a global leadership across 6 task forces, Women in Business Action Council, 2 crossing theme to ensure that this important and critical initiative is led by the global leader experts who will prove the expertise in their areas. Our task force chairs, co-chairs, executive committees, business cost leadership bring unmatched expertise in identifying key issues across B20 priorities areas. The cross-cutting topics and initiatives aim the global pandemic to address the current challenges that we are dealing with. I would like to commend how this high-level group came together and developed policy recommendations in addressing key issues for the G20. Producing robust policy recommendations following key strategic principles with the highest level of women participations. Saudi Arabia is the first MENA country to host the G20 Summit. The aim of the B20 Saudi Arabia has been to ensure that the voice for global business community in the G20 heard by the G20 leaders. To do this, B20 Saudi Arabia followed its key strategic principles. Let's start with inclusive. Ensure the B20 is open to a diverse set of backgrounds across all industry sizes, including SMEs and startups, and geographies, with an open, transparent approach through the whole process. We had a global dialogue with 15 nation chambers of commerce, with more than 3,500 plus governments and business leaders. In terms of impactful, by developing a common positions on our 7 key priorities through 25 policy recommendations and 69 policy action, which I will outline shortly with the support of very strong international network partners and an early emphasis on advocacy. We also published 3 key reports and 11 joint statements. In terms of differentiated, as a part of our unique approach, we made Women in Business in Council as one of our top themes for B20 for the first time ever. I am delighted to report that this year B20 was comprised of 650 plus participants, more than 20 plus countries, of which around 33.7% are women, the highest ever in B20s. We lived this process with our B20 community over the course of 5 months. We had 41 virtual meeting and conference calls. We have more than 26 global outreach and advocacy meeting. And today at the summit, we have more than 1,500 plus business leaders from G20 nations and beyond. B20 Saudi Arabia also engaged with the key Chamber of Commerce organizations globally, and all result through a driven dialogue and address their valuable perspective. This engagement was spread across the year and resulted into a considerable value added to our policy recommendations. B20 Saudi Arabia policy recommendation addresses a key structural challenges and are aligned with the G20. As mentioned before, we had identified key structural challenges the global business sector has been facing. 7 key themes. The pandemic has shaken the world to realize the vulnerability of healthcare infrastructures, depending on disrupted supply chain and importance of localizations, among others. B20 policy recommendations and reports address these key challenges by identifying policy actions across 3 key themes that are aligned with the G20 presidency. Empowering people by unleashing opportunities for all the B20 recommends, accelerating efforts to empower women and youth, building a workforce resilience through technology, healthcare, and also job-creating sectors such as sustainable tourism and making sustainable progress on the trade cooperations, including institutional reforms as well. Safeguarding the planet by fostering growth. By fostering growth within the limits of the planet, the B20 recommends accelerating actions to achieve carbon neutrality. Promoting cleaner and more sustainable energy system, strengthening climate resilience for infrastructures, promoting the transition to circular economy, facilitating investment in green technology, and promoting the sustainable use of freshwater system and the ocean. Shaping the new frontiers by enabling an even adoption of technology advances, enhancing resilience digital infrastructures by growing requisite skills, advancing a smart city, and managing skills risk related to corruptions and fraud. We will not stop here. The challenges are going to remain beyond this crisis situation. It's estimated that the world will lose around 20 trillion in value in 2020 and in 2021, and reset its GDP progression towards a lower trajectory. G20 role in building back our future is a better way, and we look at increasing importance of Saudi Arabia will continue to exert its leadership through unquestionable support and contribution in identifying and solving pressing problems. We will offer, as a B20 Saudi Arabia Italy, our support so that B20 business community continues to benefit from the ongoing dialogue and progress achieved so far, and work towards solving structural issues. In the end, I would like to thank G20 Saudi Arabia Presidency for giving me the opportunities to lead such a crucial engagement in a tough time. In the same time, our strong G20 business community for their valuable contributions in developing robust policy recommendations. Our Saudi Arabia Chamber of Commerce for their support and directions. Also, I would like to thank our chair, co-chair, executive committees, and business advocacy caucus for their leadership in making this B20 inclusive, impactful, and differentiated. I wish you a very productive, engaging B20 Saudi Arabia, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yusuf Al-Banyan. You have done a tremendous job setting the stage for the summit. Now I would like to introduce, on behalf of the custodian of two holy mosques, King Salman ibn Abdulaziz Al Saud, the Saudi Minister of Investment. Please welcome His Excellency Khalid Al-Faleh.
Thank you, Iam, and thank you, Yusuf. Let me also extend my greetings to our friends and partners around the world. We wish we were with you or you were with us physically, but it's not to be given the pandemics. And it's at least good to connect virtually. As mentioned, I've been given the honor and privilege to deliver the remarks on this occasion of His Majesty King Salman bin Abdulaziz, representing, of course, the presidency of the G20 in 2020. I will deliver the remarks as written in the Arabic language, but I hope they will be simultaneous translation for our audience around the world to follow. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ashab al-Sumu wal-Ma'ali.
Your Highnesses, Excellencies, good morning and good evening.
صباحكم أو مساءكم جميعا أينما كنتم. بداية
First, I would like to thank the B20 Engagement Group's chair and all of its partners from around the globe for their efforts in this exceptional time. We were looking forward to welcoming you and hosting you here in the Kingdom so you could get the chance to enjoy our heritage and our rich culture and diverse culture, and to witness the historic economic and social transformation that the Kingdom is currently undergoing. However, this pandemic did not allow that.
وقد حرصت رئاسة المملكة العربية السعودية لمجموعة العشرين خلال هذا العام.
During this year, the Saudi G20 presidency was keen to listen to your recommendations through the ministerial, Sherpa, and working group meetings, of which you were invited.
إن الهدف العام لرئاسة المملكة لمجموعة العشرين
The theme of the Saudi G20 presidency is to realizing opportunities of the 21st century for all. The presidency has focused on three main aims, namely empowering people through creating conditions that enable them, especially women and youth, to live decently, work, and prosper, and safeguarding the planet by promoting joint efforts to protect global resources, as well as shaping new frontiers by adopting bold and long-term strategies to utilize the benefits of innovation and technological advancement. During its presidency of the G20 this year, the Kingdom focused on discussing the human, social, and economic effects of the coronavirus pandemic by uniting international efforts to save lives, secure health systems responses, and protect the economy. To achieve these aims, the G20 has committed to close the immediate financial gap in global health by pledging $21 billion to support the production and distribution of diagnostics, treatments, therapeutics, and vaccines for all. The G20 has also committed to strengthening coordination to combat the pandemic at the international level, including the protection of health workers on the front lines and the delivery of food and medical supplies. It also injected around $11 trillion to protect the global economy with a clear commitment and determination to do whatever is necessary to overcome the effects of this pandemic. The G20 has given a priority to the poorest countries through the historic Debt Service Suspension Initiative, DSSI, totaling $14 billion, which provides exemptions to 73 eligible countries. Honored guests, as for the structural issues facing our economies, we cannot talk about shaping new frontiers in the G20 without discussing innovative solutions that contribute to developing the financial infrastructure, improving the global trade systems, protecting the private sector, restoring capital flows to emerging markets, and harnessing the digital economy tools that help us reach the desired financial inclusion during various circumstances. The G20 was also keen to step up the efforts that would enable us to cope with the changing nature of education and work, provide opportunities for young people to build a promising and robust economic future, and strengthen social protection systems. From the perspective of investment, business, and trade, this pandemic has caused severe disruptions in the supply chains and almost a complete shutdown in various sectors, such as tourism. It has also led to widespread disruption in global markets. Accordingly, the G20 was keen to discuss the best practices to support the recovery of international trade, stimulate economic diversification, and promote international investment, in addition to supporting the international competitiveness of MSMEs. The G20 has also undertook important steps to support the reforms of the World Trade Organization, for which the Saudi presidency of the G20 has built consensus on the Riyadh Initiative on the future of the WTO. Furthermore, the G20 has paid special attention to discussing policies concerned with developing the highest standards of transparency and integrity among all sectors, where several initiatives were aligned upon in the Anti-Corruption Ministerial Communiqué. Distinguished guests, allow me to also emphasize that most of the B20 priorities are similar to the current transformations in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. For Vision 2030 represents our roadmap for the future of our country. Your engagement group has emphasized on the aim of empowerment, and one aspect of that is represented in the Kingdom's focus on the digital economy. Under the current global shift to remote work, education, and even remote healthcare, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was a pioneer in this field. Domestically, we acknowledge that the economic empowerment of youth and women, which is one of the G20 priorities, is pivotal to realizing the optimal capabilities of our national economy. We have also implemented a wide range of reforms for women empowerment at home and work, including entrepreneurship programs and incubators, specifically preventing gender discrimination in access to financial services, which makes the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia one of the only 3 countries in the world to achieve this. Further, as safeguarding the planet is among the G20 priorities and a critical goal in which we should invest in the future, it is also a goal that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has been working on to achieve through initiating programs and projects that aim to develop renewable energy and energy efficiency, such as the circular carbon economy approach and green hydrogen in NEOM, as well as projects that consider environmental protection and sustainability measures utilized by the Red Sea Development Company, to name a few. Ladies and gentlemen, although we have faced extraordinary challenges, the pandemic demonstrated the resilience and strength of the Saudi economy, and that we are committed to increasing growth and prosperity levels through empowerment and investments in new sectors, especially the sectors that will lead the global recovery and protect countries from future pandemics. Honored guests, I would like to congratulate the leadership of the B20 and its members, especially for your proactive recommendations in light of the expectations of a second wave of the pandemic and the attention you have paid in the most pressing issues in the global economy. In conclusion, I look forward to receiving the B20 communiqué and recommendations, and we look forward to continuing our joint efforts to realize the opportunities of the 21st century for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency Khalid Al-Faleh, for your speech. If I can now turn your attention back to the stage for a video presentation. On December 1st, 2019, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia assumed the G20 presidency. Then, a group of Saudi businessmen and women took over the leadership of the B20, which represents the private sector before the G20. The B20's overarching goal was straightforward: deliver policy recommendations to G20 and advance the strength and viability of all businesses, small, medium, and large, and the communities and ecosystems which they serve. Over the past year, its 6 task forces and Women in Business Action Council have been hard at work on policy recommendations, special reports, joint statements, advocacy events, and other efforts to accomplish just that. In addition, the B20 adapted quickly to the unexpected and unprecedented challenge that COVID-19 presented, establishing a COVID-19 initiative to address the impact of the pandemic on business and society around the world. Today, its efforts will culminate as the B20 presents and hands over its summary of policy recommendations to the G20 presidency. B20 Saudi Arabia is transforming for inclusive growth by embracing action through collaboration and by placing transparency at the heart of their work. The B20 has delivered inclusive, action-oriented, and differentiated policy actions designed to empower people, safeguard the planet, and shape new frontiers. Now, I would like to welcome back to the stage the B20 Chair, Mr. Youssef Al-Bunyan. Please also welcome back to the stage on behalf of the King of Saudi Arabia and the custodian of the 2 holy mosques, King Salman ibn Abdulaziz Al Saud, the Saudi Minister of Investment, His Excellency Khalid Al-Faleh. It is the moment. I would like to ask the B20 Chair to sign the summary of policy recommendations and present it to the G20 presidency. Now, the photograph moment. Thank you very much, Mr. Al-Bunyan, and the B20 community for your incredible work. Thank you, Your Excellency Khalid Al-Faleh, for joining us. Now I would like to introduce Jillian Tett, Editor-at-Large at the Financial Times and the moderator for our first panel discussion today. Welcome, Jillian.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever in the world you are. Welcome to this session to discuss the question of B20 at 10 a decade of impact. Now, we're going to be hearing from a number of the B20 chairs in just a few minutes, both past and present, to discuss really the fundamental question, which is, what is the point of the B20? What has it done? What is it going to do? What could it do better? And what changes are needed to make it more effective? But before we start discussing those questions, we're going to hear, first of all, a teaser speech to kick off the conversation from someone who's been looking at the B20 and its important role for some time, Marcus Wallenberg, who's going to give us some opening remarks. He is the chair of the board of directors of SEB. He's also the co-chair of the B20 Saudi Arabia Trade and Investment Task Force, and he's got a wealth of experience in a number of different fields in international business. He's been acting as chair of the board of Saab. He's a member of the AstraZeneca board. He has been watching the business scene for a very long time, and he's also been chairman of the International Chamber of Commerce. So a great platform from which to share some remarks about where the B20 has been, where it's going, and what exactly it can offer to the wider business community. Over to you, Marcus Wallenberg.
Good. Okay, thank you. Program feedback and by B.
Am I on? Jag är väldigt osäker på vad det är som heter. Okay, thank you, Julian. And ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, thank you for having me. I'm Marcus Wallenberg, chairman of SEB in Stockholm. I just want to start out by saying what an excellent process the whole B20 leadership question has been in with the Saudi leadership and Lubna Lion in the case of the group that I participated in. It's really been an honor and privilege to participate in this group. And I like to say that, of course, this has been a difficult time. The COVID has impacted us all, and that is no question about that. But I also think that in these times when it's so easy to go into a protectionistic mode, the need for cooperation is always shown to be a very, very present question. We all have value chains globally or regionally. We all are very dependent on the question of science and innovation, and all of this comes together right now. So the whole B20, G20 is, of course, about global cooperation in one way or another. And I came into this a number of years ago, personally, from the point of view being the chairman of International Chamber of Commerce and participating in the B20 rounds at an early stage. We were dealing at the time with the question of governments and WTO trying to find a common platform and an agreement around something that we all thought was very, very important, multilateral trading under the Doha discussion. And in the years to come, when we were able to get that in place, and we fell into the whole question of the global financial crisis, which in itself put a lot of strain. I think the G20, B20 cooperation, and especially the whole idea around governments putting together support around limiting protectionism, supporting trade finance, getting a scorecard on G20 businesses, and also getting a framework around how to network and being a partnership around the world has all grown into this support structure around G20 and B20. And at least a personal reflection from my side, I think it's quite clear that in these years we have shown that the consistent and the persistent message from business is part of the whole question of getting things moving in the right direction. So I do think that B20 has served a very, very strong role. So why is this important? Well, at least from my point of view, we are all talking about the liberal market economy, and we all wish to have that as a fundamental basis. Trade is extremely important, investment is extremely important, and a number of issues around that has to be there. And in my view, the whole discussion around, you could say, climate change or other international agreements have to a very large extent dependent on business and government working together. So the cooperative element of working together in the future will be extremely important to solve some of the really present challenges that we all have on this planet right now. And I think about questions of protectionism, which still is alive. I think about sustainability, which, the Paris Accord and so on, we all have to work together to do that. I think about the question of digitization and thereby also trying to achieve inclusive growth. So all of these questions come together, demands cooperation. B20, in my view, continues to have an important role to serve here. We're living in unprecedented times in terms of new technology, new science coming through. Computational efforts and computational technologies has given us completely new ways to deal with moving technology up the curve and bringing innovation to the table, which will be absolutely crucial to solve these problems going forward. So I hope that collaboration stays here. I hope collaboration will be developed even further. And I do believe that we are looking forward with this Saudi initiative on the B20, G20 as a further step in that direction. Thank you very much, Jill.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Marcus Wallenberg. I think everyone watching would echo your hope that collaboration does indeed remain the key theme of the day, because at times of rising protectionism, the pandemic-induced crisis, and rapid technological change, there's certainly plenty of forces pulling in the other direction right now. So what we're going to do now is have some comments from the panelists of both past and former chairs of the B20 who are going to offer their thoughts about where the B20's come from and where it's now going. I'm going to introduce them. First up is I'd like to introduce Mr. Yusuf Al-Banyan, the chair of the B20 in Saudi Arabia. Welcome. Assalamu alaikum. Mr. Al-Banyan is the vice chair and CEO of SABIC, who is one of the largest petrochemical manufacturers in the world. He's also got a wide range of different board positions, which bring a broad perspective on business. And he's also head of the Global Business Council, the Bloomberg Global Forum, and the International Business Council of the World Economic Forum. He was a member of that. Along with him, we have Dr. Daniel Fuentes de Roja, who was former chair of the B20 in Argentina. He is a member of the National Academy of Law and Social Sciences of Buenos Aires, and he's a vice president of Argentina's National Academy of Business Sciences. And he's previously been president of the International Organization of Employers. We also have Dr. Alexander Shokhin, who is the chair of the B20 of Russia formerly. He's president of the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, and he's also an economist and researcher and a member of the Russian Academy of Natural Sciences and the Russian Academy of Technological Sciences, among other things. And last but not least, we got Richard Koida, who was chair of B20 Australia. He is currently acting as the chairperson of Qantas Airways and the Woodside Petroleum Limited, and the AFL Commission and the governing body of Australian Rules Football. So again, a wide range of perspectives. So lots of experience on this panel, but I'd like to start perhaps with a question to Yusuf Al-Banyan, which is this. In the past, there's been a lot of discussion about the G20, the actions of governments in terms of battling crises, particularly in the last 2008 crisis. But I'm curious, how do you think the role of the B20, the business voice, has changed as a result of COVID? And as you prepare to hand over your role running the B20 to the next presidency, what do you think you've learned during this last absolutely extraordinary year? Mr. Al-Banyan.
Well, again, thank you for giving me opportunities to share with you our B20 experience. But I think it will be very difficult for me to sum up the lesson learned that we have gone through during this pandemic crisis. I think we have been able to see so many changes on a very speedy manner. But what I can tell you, I think the G20, they have really made the right choice after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. They have really realized that the public and private sector, they have to work on collaborative approach in order for them to overcome any economical challenges that they're going to face. And I think this is where is the inception of B20 during 2008, and I think they have been able to contribute through a policy recommendation that was able to really transform the economy since that time. But in terms of what we have learned as well, I mean, you introduced me as really a leader in the chemical companies, chemicals dealing with catalysts, and I think I have to highlight the credit for B20 presidency in KSA is really given to all more than 700 participants in more than 20 nations. And I was only the catalyst for excellent, smart, and highly talented individuals across the nation. They were able to come and debate all the issues. But I think what also we need to highlight, when we started the presidency in December 2019, we were not expected to have the pandemic. And I have to say, 2020 is a unique year. I mean, if you compare it since the Spanish flu in 1918 or even the Great Depressions in 1930, I can say we never had something like that. The aftermath of the pandemic is really the real challenges. Normally, the crisis happens after any specific incidents happening globally, like the Spanish flu or the Great Depressions. So the B20 in Saudi Arabia, they have been proactively changing its plan and come up with a very strong collaborative approach. We started with ICC, we started with WHO in order for us to send a letter to the G20 and explain our demands for a common platform in order for them to come up with coordinated global actions. Not only that, we have also anticipated as a business community that could be a second or third wave of coronavirus. So we came up with a virtual meeting with more than 600 global leaders. And then we have really initiated what we call it COVID-19 initiatives. By end of July, we were able to submit reports to G20, explain to them the high-level immediate actions is required, either on protecting the healthcare system or protecting the financial system and make sure there is always access to fund for small and medium-sized companies specifically, and more importantly, energize the supply chain to energize certain specific sector to contribute to the revival of our global economy. And not to forget as well, during this time we need to be very careful around compliance and integrity, which normally gets hurt badly during this time. So the B20 has been successfully able to show the G20 leaders since their inception in 2008, they made the right choice to work hands in hands with the business community. And I think this is something is going to be clearly visible, not only this year, but also years to come.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Al-Banyan. I'd like to now turn to Mr. Funes de Rioja and ask him, as the former head of the B20 from Argentina. What has changed in your view since your presidency? And are there sort of any key metrics you'd point to illuminate what's changed and where things are going now?
Well, thank you. First of all, thanks for the invitation, and thanks my colleague Joseph Abdullah Albanian for his kind words and participation of all of us. First thing that I want to remark is that when we started this type of process, G20, with the head of states, also response to the 2008 international financial crisis, in order to build up a global strategy to reduce the impact on the real economy and consequently unemployment. Same way, COVID-19 as a global crisis is impacting also on the economy and employment. Which is the difference between 2008, 2009 or nowadays? We have experience. Why? Because we built up a relationship between our members as a part of the B20 and paving the way in order to have, first of all, coordination, second, objectives, definition of policies, means of action, action plans, in order to make it happen. That's clear, a process in which we learn a lot. And that's the reason by which, and certainly we need to recognize that in a year like this, we could have a response because we are absolutely responsible that we needed to have a response to this COVID crisis in order to minimize or neutralize the damage or distortions as a consequence of the crisis, but also to project this new model that this year was called Transforming for Inclusive Growth. Then the question is how to answer to the crisis. Second, how to continue dealing with a project that includes a lot of things, because the key question is to have an effective multilateralism, not abandon that, certainly not protectionist policies, but fair trade and fair globalization, promote growth and equal opportunities, inclusiveness, climate action and sustainable use of resources that are and will be at the center of the B20 agenda, because the role of the private sector is crucial to pave the way for sustainable development. And I want to reinforce this, because for the business community, the B20 means combining private initiatives, international markets, and fair and transparent rule of the game, and creating with public-private cooperation policies that are not merely nominal, but real and effective. Thus, the aim of our final document, as the recommendation, in any case, is to suggest concrete policies and plans of action that may contribute to G20 countries' economic and social development, taking into consideration the main topics and issues of this B20 agenda. That's the reason by which these formulations are strong with all the previous experience. We are testing it in this difficult year, but we are convinced of that. And the key question is to consolidate the B20, the G20 as a process, the B20 participation, the relationship with other actors of the civil society, certainly unions, try to find a way in order to have coordinated or concerted policies, because we need it now, but not because the crisis, but also looking at the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And that leads very nicely into my question for Mr. Shokhin, which is, I mean, under the presidency of the Russian delegation, the B20 shifted very much to a focus on collaboration and cooperation between civil society and business and government. Can you tell us, why and how this developed and how you see it moving in the future?
Thank you very much, Gillian. Thank you for Saudi Arabia presidency to invite me to this session. First of all, I would like to mention 10 points of our activity during the Russian cycle of B20 process. Number 1 point. It was active engagement in the B20 Russia in the agenda setting of the Russian G20 presidency. The early appointment of the chair of the B20 provides business a formal opportunity to participate in this process of the agenda setting. The second point. A very similar structure of B20 task forces and G20 working groups. The level of coincidence between them was 2/3. 4 of 6 substantial B20 task forces had so-called G20 twins. The third point, an early launch of B20 process. We held the kickoff meeting in the very beginning of December 2012, simultaneously with the first G20 Sherpas meeting. So the B20 started the cooperation with G20 not as a Russian entity, but a united entity of international business community. Fourth, the intensive activity of B20 in the recommendations development through joint meetings with the G20 Sherpas, G20 working groups, ministerial meetings, and other outreach groups. Fifth point, sustaining continuity with the previous presidencies concerning the agenda setting and the Troika functioning. All task forces established under the Russian B20 presidency to rank degrees were focused on the themes underpinned the task forces in the previous presidencies of Mexico, France, and Republic of Korea. The Russian presidency paid extra attention to consolidating institutional frameworks of B20 for the future and their coordination with the colleagues from Australia and Turkey. The Troika mechanism allowed to coordinate the work between the former, the present, and the future B20 chairs, and this mechanism began to function, frankly speaking, in practice in 2013 during the Russian presidency. By the way, the issue of digital economy and the internet, we tried to promote even in 2013. But the first time this theme was reflected in G20 leaders' statement only on G20 Hangzhou Summit, and mostly due to the efforts of the Troika, chair and co-chairs of the B20. Sixth point, the maximum involvement of the leading businesses in the B20 process by nominating their representatives both as the B20 task forces members and co-chairs. Seventh, the complex engagement of the leading knowledge, BCG, McKinsey, Deloitte, EY, KPMG, and network partners, World Economic Forum, OECD, International Organization of Employers, International Chamber of Commerce, etc. At the same time, the main agenda issues were developed by the business representatives in the task forces. Eighth point, presentation of the draft recommendations in the major public forums and events for discussions and fine-tuning. To finalize the development of B20 recommendations and consensus building process, we released so-called Green Book contained draft recommendations. We presented this paper at the G20 Sherpas meeting and the B20 Summit. This experience of early presentation was very successful, and since 2014, we tried to use the opportunity together with B20 chair to organize the presentation of the recommendations on the so-called regional consultation forums in the framework of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, SPIF. The goal of the forum is to present the recommendations of B20 in the Eurasian region. In 2020, due to the unfavorable international epidemiological situation, we held the forum in the virtual format, but next year we believe it would be possible to see our partners on SPIF on a live basis. Ninth point, complex approach to the advocacy of the recommendations. We had held B20 Summit under the Russian presidency 3 months before the G20 Summit. That allowed us not only to finalize the draft recommendations, but also to promote the B20 recommendations in close cooperation with G20 Sherpas and working groups to include them in the G20 Summit's final documents. Furthermore, at the G20 Summit in September 2013, 2/3 of the G20 leaders participated in the special meeting with the B20 delegation. It was the real recognition of B20 status as a key outreach group of the G20. And finally, the complex review of B20 recommendations under the previous presidencies. The B20 task force on G20 B20 dialogue efficiency, which we created during Russian presidency, succeeded to the 2011 Global Governance Task Force and the 2012 Advocacy and Impact Task Force, initiated a review of B20 recommendations made since Toronto and their impact on G20 decision-making as reflected in the G20 documents. For this purpose, the methodology for assessment and analysis of all recommendations since 2010 had been elaborated. The review and the catalogue of all B20 recommendations made since Toronto, produced by the task force, consolidated the B20 members' individual wisdom into the institutional memory. In conclusion, I would like to say that more than 50% of our recommendations, precisely 53% of our recommendations, have been included as a specific decision or mentioned in the St. Petersburg Summit final documents. Of course, the ratio varies from the sphere to one sphere to the other, but it was fairly high concerning the top priorities of G20 and B20, such as macroeconomics, inclusive growth, investment, financial regulations, and employment. And I believe that all our achievements, it's possible to use them in forthcoming years to increase efficiency of B20 activity. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Shurkin. 53% shows that progress has been made. It also shows that there's more to be done. And one of the questions I'm going to be asking all the panelists in just a moment is where you think the B20 will be in the next 5 to 10 years. But before I do that, I'd like to bring in Mr. Cowder into the conversation and ask you in particular, since you were chairing the B20 as part of the cycle, the Australian cycle, the word inclusivity, inclusive growth, has really become a key buzzword, a key mantra. I'm curious, how do you see this new focus on inclusive growth developing? What's changed from when Australia was chairing the B20, and where do you see the B20 going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, thank you, Gillian, and can I also thank and congratulate Mr. Albanyan and the Saudis on the work that they've done with this year's B20. Gillian, when we hosted the G20 and the B20 in 2014, we were looking at not dissimilar economic challenges, significant youth unemployment and a lack of growth, But there's been, I think, significant change over the last 6 years, which has, as Mr. Albanian has illustrated, also has become much more difficult with the pandemic. So two things that I think have grown significantly since Australia hosted the G20 and the B20, and that is climate change and the need for concrete actions from the broad community, and particularly the business community, on climate change. And your word, inclusiveness, and that goes to appropriate gender equality, to inclusiveness in terms of business bringing communities with them. But Gillian, I would say this, I think there's never been a more important time for businesses to lead, to take us forward and to work with government and communities, all other stakeholders, to deal with the very, very significant issues that globally we're going to be dealing with. And that's going to require coordination across the international bodies, coordination across countries. And I think business, more than ever, is going to have to lead in that discussion and in that work through advocacy with our own in-country politicians and advocacy across borders, because I think we've got a much different geopolitical environment at the moment than we had even 5 years ago, and overlay that with the challenging economic environment. So in answer to your question about where will the G20 and the B20 be in 5 or 10 years, I hope it is as relevant and more relevant than it is today. I hope that it is business that is leading inclusive growth, getting people back into the workplace, looking after the environment, looking after the communities in which we operate. And I hope businesses are forceful, but through doing the right thing in terms of getting our governments to support the actions we all need. And they are consistent, as every speaker has said, they're pretty consistent and have been over the last 10 years, the actions that we need to ensure that we achieve this inclusive growth.
Right. Just before I turn to the other panelists, can I ask, do you think that the business community has been sufficiently speedy in putting issues like climate change and social inclusion on the international agenda?
Gillian, no, I think too often business reacts, and I think business does need to lead. Now, that's not every business. There are some businesses which are magnificent in their leadership, and we all know those businesses. But business has moved from being a profit-centred activity to a growth and create value for all stakeholders. And I don't think we can expect to be listened to and to lead on this unless we do operate in a way which is inclusive and which is sustainable. And I think all my colleagues agree with that. The reality is that we've got to ensure that each of our businesses do that, and businesses in the countries that we operate do that.
Right. I'd like to ask Mr. Albanian, where do you see the B20 being in 5 to 10 years? And do you think there needs to be more focus on issues of the environment and social inclusion?
Again, I think the questions in terms of where we see the B20 10 years from today, I think I would like to start with the fact that prior the COVID-19, we start seeing a trend of protectionism and populism within the globe. And unfortunately, even when the pandemic erupted early January and February, we have seen some governments have taken certain measures in order for them to lock down their neighbors and borders, and at the same time come up with really a local policy that serve and protect their people. But 6 weeks later, they have realized the only way for them to overcome the pandemic challenges, they need to work on collaborative approach with the globe, because this has to be a global solutions. And I'm positive around the fact that this is a quick lesson learned for the entire globe, that the only way for us to manage this globally, we need to come up with really a global platform to create a collaborative and also inclusive growth, as we see here in B20 Saudi Arabia. Not only this, in the same times also the business community have demonstrated a responsibility towards the entire globe. When the crisis erupted, people are not looking at it from a business community only as really serving their shareholders. They are looking at it from a stakeholder's perspective. They have included all stakeholders into their minds and hearts in order for them to come up with really solutions to overcome the implications and impact of COVID-19. So I think the business community have shown that responsibility. Not only this, also we have seen industry are changing their production line. If you look at automotive, they have moved from producing cars to ventilators. If you look at hotels, they move their hotels into hospitals. Certain manufacturing, they move into personal protective equipments and so on. And I think this is a demonstration that business community has a crucial role to play into the entire global society. This will enhance the position of the role of the B20, and I'm confident the B20 after this sessions, especially what KSA has been able to do with the current environment that we have really been able to deal with, the global business community have really come together and work within the B20 Saudi Arabias in order for us to provide solutions. And I think we have been successfully showcase the business global community, and this will bring a long-lasting sustainability of the role of the B20.
Right, thank you. Mr. Fernando Rioja, I'm curious, you have had this leading role as in the Employers Association in Latin America, Argentina. I'm curious, how do you see the stakeholder debate developing in terms of employers and employees, and where do you see the B20 in 5-10 years' time?
Well, let me tell you that during our term in 2019, we not only we had the honor to be host, and our B20 had a very active participation of the business community, not only at local but also international level. But at that time, we consolidated the Global Business Coalition, that was an alliance of business organizations, in order to have a clear role as an international community. The second thing that I want to recall the attention is what we reinforce the idea of the Troika. That's the reason Alexander Shokin mentioned that. But which we work with our predecessors, China and Germany, and later on with Japan and Saudi Arabia, in order to consolidate this agenda. Regarding the question of the relationship with stakeholders, first, what our first concern was to be sure that all the levels of the business community were committed. Not only the large company, but also the small and middle company were involved. And all the regions of my country, that is a large country, and with different conditions. And the second one was to have a relationship with the workers through in between the B20 and L20. And I want to say that we sign up a common understanding in order to discuss the question of education and employment. I think it was very important at that time. And we follow the patterns of the German model, linking education with employment. And the union's leader accepted that. And we work together, looking at the future and the impact of Industry 4.0 and digitalization and so on. The second question that we took into account is the need to be sure that we had a document for advocacy. And we created a high-level caucus, following an example created by the Americans at the time that they had the G20 process, and our colleagues, the B20. And to be sure that each one of the members could transfer to their governments to lobby the responsibles of the G20 in order to try to have impact of the B20 recommendations on the G20 final document. I want to tell you finally that the other question that we need to take care is about the follow-up. What happened next? Then, okay, is the declaration the last participation? And after that, you need to continue dealing with the question of follow-up of what happened with the previous declaration and looking at the future. Because what we see in general terms is that the multilateral system normally make a lot of declarations, but without concrete outcomes and results or impact. And as business community, we are convinced that we need impact. And let me tell you that in our case, we could involve more than 1,700 business leaders, 34% of small companies, 27% of women at that time, and more than 1,000 CEOs and CFOs, 60 or 70%, between 60 to 70% international ones, and the other local ones. And that was a great impact. You need to remember that only 3 countries at the region have G20s. It's Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. Till now, it's Mexico and Argentina that could do it. Then what we try to do is to show up first that Latin America is well prepared in order to deal with this question and to discuss internationally. Second, to give continuity to the present and looking at the future. And that's the reason why we continue working with all of our colleagues at the B20 level. And we are committed with the values, transparency, multilateralism, fair trade and globalization and so on, and with the commitments regarding what we can define as a growth inclusive policy.
Right. Well, that leads very nicely into a question I'd like to put to Dr. Shokin from the audience, which is, what do you think about the furthered and continued development of B20 cooperation? How do you get the 47% of your points and requests to be on the agenda next time?
First of all, I would like to say that for Russian business community, social inclusion and climate change they are the real challenges for Russian business. And we would like to use Japanese experience during the Japanese presidency, the special book of the best corporate practices of the sustainable development on corporate level in different countries, not only within G20, but also in the developing world, in Africa, for example. This book was very, not only interesting, but important to, to use this experience by other companies, corporates, etc. It seems to me it would be good to use this approach during next presidencies. And second, I'd like to say that climate change for us now it's very important challenge. And because, new Green Deal, European Green Deal, might lead to the unfair competition between exporters to European Union and European companies, original European companies. That's why we would like to use, fair approach to coincide and combine WTO standards and international legislation with new Green Deal. But at the same time, we would like to go very rapidly to minimize emission, carbon emission. Russia is one of the leaders in this field. But at the same time, we have to have not only macro-regional rules like European Green Deal, but international rules in this field. Speaking about the role of B20 in forthcoming 5-10 years, it seems to me that G20 mechanism is the most efficient mechanism in comparison with WTO, even with United Nations institutions. and B20 as a key outreach group, it seems to me have good chances not only to survive, but to influence to the decision-making process, agenda process, and fulfillment of the obligations of the G20. To do this, it seems to me that B20 needs to improve self-organization using the best national practices. And also, it would be necessary to organize more efficient mechanism of cooperation between B20 and G20. For example, it would be good to have joint meetings of B20 task forces and G20 working groups. Perhaps it would be good to organize joint working groups. Also, it seems to me that it's necessary to invite business community united in B20 to solve emergency issues like COVID pandemic situation, because one of the real problem for many industries, companies, etc., it's the lockdowns. Just a few days ago, we met Mr. Putin, Russian president, and we agreed that no new lockdowns will be introduced. But at the same time, the companies, the business community has to follow all strong recommendations of the healthcare institutions, and we have to work here together, minimize economic consequences of pandemic, but at the same time to improve the situation with our labor force, with families of our employees, etc. And finally, I want to say that we have more close cooperate with other outreach groups. Labor 20, Women 20, Civil 20, Think 20, Youth 20, and of course, in all this direction of cooperation, B20 has to be as a key element, because G20 is economic institution, and B20 has to be in the center of this outreach family.
Right. Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Shurkin. We don't have a lot more time left, but I'm very keen to bring in Marcus Wallenberg to get your reactions and thoughts on this. When you look ahead 5-10 years, what do you expect to see? What do you want to see? And to what degree do you think innovation can be supported right now in these current pandemic troubled times?
Well, Gillian, I think two points here. First, I do believe that business is well aware of that protectionism and isolationism does not really work and doesn't really lead in a historical perspective into something good. I do believe that all of us dealing with international trade and investments know that this is a win-win proposition, not a zero-sum game. And I think this is worthwhile to point out to politicians year and year again, and therefore I think the B20 has a very important role to fill also going forward. If we're going to be able, secondly, if we're going to be able to deal with some of the biggest challenges facing us all, we need innovation. I come from a country which we call the triple helix. We work together, academia, business, and government together. I think this is an important concept to think about, that we're all in this together. If we're going to deal with sustainability, for example, and climate, which is a global problem, it's not for a single nation, it's a global problem, we need innovation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's been a fascinating discussion. A number of key themes have been touched on. I guess I would take away 3 or 4 key points. Firstly, at a time of rising protectionism, there is a strong desire to push for global cooperation. Secondly, people recognize that they need to get the business voice out and may need some institutional changes or process changes to ensure that happens alongside the governmental voice, as Dr. Shurkin says. Perhaps having more regular liaisons and dialogue between the G20 and B20 is important. Thirdly, another key point is that inclusive growth, inclusion, is absolutely center stage right now as people look to the pandemic and its terrible impacts. And fourthly, there is a strong desire to make sure that the concept of market forces, businesses, commerce remains very much on the agenda. So it just relies for me to say a big thank you to all of you for sharing your thoughts. Very best of luck in pushing forward these goals. And we're now going to turn to the next panelist, who's going to give us a very different perspective in terms of what is needed now to push forward the B20 agenda. So thank you.
Thank you.
Now, we're going to be talking next. Well, thank you to everyone once again for that very interesting panel discussion to frame the debate. And as I said earlier, some of the key themes that have emerged is a growing focus on inclusion, inclusive growth, and looking both at the social aspects of inclusive growth and the environmental and sustainability aspects of that. Another key focus was the need for business to work with government and multilateral institutions and wider society. And a third crucial theme was the need to fight protectionism and to work within a global context. And we're now going to be hearing from Werner Hoyer, Dr. Werner Hoyer, who runs the European Investment Bank, which has a particularly interesting role to play right now in all of those three aspects. The EIB is obviously a major pillar of the European Union's attempt to push forward growth in a socially inclusive way, and also to champion cooperation between the government, non-governmental and business world. As part of the European Union, it's been seeking to try and take a more global international approach. And although it's obviously European, as its name suggests, it is trying to work outside the European Union as well, and essentially promote an idea of development and growth, which can help build more global cooperation. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of what the EIB has been doing, and something that Dr. Hoyer is going to be talking about in particular, is a question of environmental sustainability and climate change. Early this year, the EIB came out with a series of announcements about how it was changing its rules in relation to financing fossil fuels, which are not just significant in terms of what the EIB itself has been doing, but have a wider significance for the private sector more broadly. Because as the EIB lays out its strategy, it's also creating a sense for what the private sector can or cannot do, and where financial support for fossil fuels and environmental change is heading more broadly. And of course, that plays into the wider international debate about where the efforts to promote a more inclusive framework are going in the future. So there are many reasons why the role of the EIB is interesting, not just from the perspective of Europe, not just from the perspective of a quasi-governmental financing body, but also in terms of being a bellwether, or if you like, a litmus test for the broader climate in the future. And as we've heard discussed a lot of times in the last few minutes, we are living through extraordinary times when every institution and every part of society is being called on to play a role in terms of where the sector is going. So I'd like now to turn over to Dr. Hoyer and the EIB to get a perspective from him about where we're heading next.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be with you today. Let me thank you for this opportunity to talk about the transformation for inclusive growth. In these exceptional times, the gravity of the COVID crisis is still unfolding. We are required to take all the necessary steps to cushion the health and economic fallout. But while this is already a daunting challenge per se, we have to think and plan for the recovery and for the future. We have to be decisive about the principles that will guide us. Let me stress to you that solidarity and partnerships will be indispensable. The COVID crisis, from a health tragedy and economic disaster, is already a social crisis. The World Bank estimates that an additional 88 million people will live in extreme poverty in 2020. It is clear that COVID has derailed many global efforts in meeting many sustainable development goals. Africa has lost decades of efforts for sustainable development and millions of jobs without the protection of social safety nets. The consequences of the climate emergency are still unfolding, and again, the poor and the vulnerable are the most affected. Let me share with you my belief that any response needs to take a very clear path towards sustainable and inclusive growth. This virus is taking an immense toll on human lives. But unfortunately, people also die today, now as I speak, as a consequence of climate change. They die of floods, of droughts, of vast and unstoppable forest fires. They die because all these scourges lay their countries to waste, leaving them with nothing. And in some cases, they die in perilous journeys, fleeing their homes to escape extreme poverty. It is imperative that COVID does not dilute our commitment towards climate and sustainable growth agendas. A stronger and faster action and a more ambitious plan for the path towards meeting SDGs need to be built. It is shocking to see how fast the clocks are ticking. Think of this. All 5 of the warmest years since 1880 have occurred since 2015. We face an unprecedented loss of biodiversity and significant threats across global ecosystems. So we do not have any buffer time left for climate. How can we square the circle then? How can we combine short-term recovery needs and long-term action? To be very frank, investing and creating jobs in industries with no long-term future is money wasted. To do so at a time when we can redirect investment to sustainable jobs in industries that can actively counter climate change would be a terrible error. The pandemic has led us to rethink many aspects of our lives. Let us turn it into a defining moment in our fight against climate change and environmental degradation. Our recovery must be efficient. We need to transform the way our economies work by investing heavily on new technologies, on skills and infrastructure, all entailing climate change, climate mitigation in particular, and climate adaptation. We have to replace lost jobs with sustainable and socially inclusive economic activity, adapted to and resilient to climate shocks. What does this transformation really mean for the economy and public policy? Climate action requires serious structural change, and it implies tremendous investment. In Europe, to achieve the 2030 greenhouse gas reduction target alone, we need an estimated 350 billion euros of additional investment annually. That's double-digit increase compared to current total investment levels. Yet volume is not the only important requirement. We must focus on the quality of each investment and on its impact. How much greener does it make the recovery? Is it economically and financially viable across its lifetime? How does it support competitiveness, jobs, quality of life? We must deliver on an abundance of low-cost renewable power, for example. We have to mass electrify transport. We have to improve energy efficiency in everything we do. We need to develop and deploy low-carbon energy carriers, with clean hydrogen being the front runner in that field presently. And decarbonizing energy-intensive industries through the application of new technologies. All these actions require massive investment in research and development. While the European Union was the first to commit to net zero, other countries are going in the same direction. According to a recent statement by President Xi, China, producing more than 1/4 of the world's CO2 emissions, will aim to reach climate neutrality by 2060. This commitment reinforces the sense of a new global paradigm requiring massive structural change along the way. And this underlines the importance of climate and environmental issues to long-term global competitiveness and growth. That said, we need to remember that for some countries, the recovery from effects of COVID-19 and the transition towards net zero will be extremely complicated for many people, firms, and territories. The needed changes do not have to be at the expense of the poorest or of the weakest in our societies and countries. They need to bring widespread opportunities, jobs, and quality of life. They should be sustainable from an ethical and societal standpoint. The success in combining environmental sustainability and improved social development will be measured by the capacity to reach out to communities affected by conflict, fragility, and migration. A year ago, we at the European Investment Bank announced our intention of transforming into the EU Climate Bank. This represented a giant step in our ambition to contribute to the transition to carbon neutrality and increased climate resilience. To make this happen, we have set ourselves 3 high-level operational goals. First, the European Investment Bank will drastically increase its level of support for climate action and environmental sustainability investment. Half of our overall annual lending volume, 50%, will go to climate action and the environment by 2025 and beyond. Secondly, we aim to support and trigger 1 trillion euros of green investment over the critical decade ahead. Finally, we pledge to align everything we do to the goals and principles of the Paris Agreement by the end of this year. 2 months from now, all our new financing will be Paris aligned. We will put climate into everything we do. And we will be rigorous about this. As the EU Climate Bank, it would make no sense for the European Investment Bank Group to support the Paris Agreement with 50% of our finance if at the same time some of the other 50% of our lending undermine the low carbon goals. Therefore, in line with the principles of sustainable finance, we will ensure that all our finance projects do not significant harm to the low carbon and climate resilient goals of the agreement. This ambition will entail huge changes. At the EIB Group, we need to accelerate our green financing activities to reach the ambitious goals set by our shareholders, but we have a solid foundation to build on. Since 2012, we have provided 170 billion of finance, supporting over 600 billion euro of investment in projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and help countries and regions to adapt to the impacts of climate change. This makes the European Investment Bank, one of the world's largest providers of finance for projects supporting climate action and environmental sustainability. Last year alone, we invested approximately 21 billion euros in green projects. This accounted for 34% of our lending volume. These activities, like the other lending of the European Investment Bank, are funded through the issuance of bonds on the international capital markets. As the inventors of green bonds in 2007, we have been instrumental in the development of the green capital markets. Since that first issuance, we have supplied more than 33 billion euros of climate awareness bonds, as we call our green bonds, all allocated to climate change mitigation. More recently, we have pioneered sustainability awareness bonds, the proceeds of which contribute to environmental and social sustainability objectives. Financial markets have evolved rapidly over the last years so that green investments can flourish. We have contributed actively to the development of the EU's sustainable finance taxonomy and to the draft green bond standards. This voluntary standard is an important step towards a wider and yet more transparent and robust green bond market. All this work on the taxonomy is aimed, on the one hand, at preventing greenwashing. A more positive, transformative way to look at it is to say that it makes green markets more transparent, which in turn makes them more attractive for private investors. And much of all the long-term green investment that we need will be driven by the private sector. But the taxonomy and the green bond standard are excellent examples of the behind-the-scenes role the public sector can play in accelerating and facilitating the reorientation of financial flows towards sustainable finance. Climate will be central to our strategy, global operations, and cooperation with others. We're expanding the scope and the reach of our partnerships. To maximize our global impact, we are ready to partner with others, not just as an incubator of finance, but an incubator for knowledge and ideas that drive the transition towards a low-carbon environment. Ladies and gentlemen, for a true recovery, the resources available must be spent wisely, with a long-term vision in mind. Every cent spent on the recovery must have positive climate, environmental, and social impact combined. This will allow us to introduce the deep structural shifts in our economies that are necessary. It would also demonstrate to the younger generation that we have heard their concerns for the future, thus providing social solidarity. COVID-19 has reminded us of the fragility of human life and the importance of standing together. The purpose of economic activity is to sustain our societies and the lives of our citizens. Now is the time to recognize that we must take a new path to achieve this goal. Let us turn our pandemic recovery into a defining moment in our fight against climate change and environmental degradation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Hoye, for that rousing call to arms, which is very timely in terms of your focus on international cooperation, because just this morning, Japan came out and laid out its own climate agenda. Now, there's a lot of things I'd like to ask there, but perhaps I can start by picking up a point you made about the green capital markets and trying to redirect private financial flows to support this. What, in your view, is a key impediment right now to the green capital markets becoming bigger? And do you see the taxonomy that the European Union is laying out in cooperation with yourself and the European Central Bank as being essentially the key standard that's going to shape global action going forward? I mean, are you de facto becoming the standard setter of the world?
Well, if somebody else would set standards which are as clear and tough, transparent, and accountable for, as the European Commission is trying now for the European Union, it would be fine for us also to follow other examples. But I think for the time being, the European Union is the front runner. Of course, we are ready to cooperate with others also on the taxonomy, but we need such an instrument. You know, when we entered the first ones, the green bond market at that time, there was an enormous skepticism. Is what we want to finance with our green bond purchases really going to end up in green projects? Is a white piece of paper painted green all of a sudden a guarantee that what comes out of it is a green project? So therefore, greenwashing, green cheating, and all these experiences we had in the past must be finally overcome. And I think we have made huge progress in the last years. At the same time, on the markets, you find much more interest on the side of the investors for projects like these. By the way, not only for sustainable projects, but also for projects which serve other non-climate related sustainable development goals. And we all know that we will never be able to finance the reaching of the sustainable development goals out of state pockets alone, out of budgets alone. We need to mobilize the private sector for this. But the private sector, with very good reason, insists that we provide transparency, accountability, and reliability. And this is why I believe this taxonomy is so important. It's a great step forward. If others have better ideas, I'm ready to inquire and to follow, but let us make the first steps as quickly as possible around the world.
Do you think, I mean, you may make a very good point that the European Union has been more proactive than elsewhere in laying this out, and it is having a global impact. Do you think, though, that it's time to move from a world where you define activities as simply green and brown into two different buckets, into more of a focus on transition as companies and sectors move from being brown towards green, and essentially need instruments like transition bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, or more of a sliding scale in the way that the taxonomy works, or more broadly, the way that businesses around the world within the B20 look at these sustainability issues now?
Julian, I couldn't agree more, because when we set our objectives for the new energy lending policy end of last year, and at the end of the day of months of negotiations within the bank and within the European Union institutions, we received more than 90% support in the gremia of the bank, in the governing bodies of the bank. That was the outcome of endless negotiations and talks, attempts to understand the problems of those countries, those regions, those economies who have the biggest problems moving from a carbon or from fossil fuels to non-fossil fuel energy policies. And that means we need to be able and ready to help those regions with concrete programs to organize the transition. There is no reason to hide behind these problems or behind COVID nowadays in order not to engage in climate action. No, we should use this opportunity we have now, but make sure that all can follow. I mean, I always put it into the picture, the last coal miner who will move out of the mine in southern Silesia or in Poland, he will not be the head of the digital startup in 3 days. But we must enable him to play an important role in an economic context that altogether is moving into a carbon neutral future. And therefore, I think the expectations of the countries which still depend heavily upon coal and gas must be supported strongly by the institutions of the European Union, and we are one of them.
Right. I often think that, in fact, instead of talking about green and brown, we should be talking today about olive and aiming for a greener shade of olive. But I'm curious, as you look at the role of the European Investment Bank, to what degree do you think there needs to be more blended finance or ways of trying to have the public sector assume some of the risks that the private sector is not able to take? Because in many ways, blended finance has been very slow to develop to address these issues around the world.
In view of the fact that, as I've already stated, we will not reach the Sustainable Development Goals with state money alone, it is absolutely necessary to move forward with blended finance. We in the European Union and in this very bank, as a matter of fact, in this office where I'm sitting right now, we have made this huge experience extremely valuable experience with the so-called Juncker plan, investment plan for Europe, 7 years ago, when Jean-Claude Juncker entered the race into the candidacy for the European Commission's presidency by saying we need to overcome this investment hesitation of many potential investors in Europe. We have huge projects, very, very good technologically and economically good projects. At the same time, we had an enormous liquidity swamping the markets. So why did this liquidity not move into these projects? Well, obviously there is a risk hesitation or aversion behind that. So the idea of Juncker was, okay, let's still rely upon the private sector, but let's give incentives via the EU budget to say, via guarantee program, very limited in size, by the way, by this guarantee facility, we give reassurance to an investor who goes into a risky project that if something goes wrong, the first piece of that loss will be taken up by the budget. And this triggered an investment wave of more than 500 billion euros since then. So it has shown that we can find ways how to incentivize the private sector to engage in these projects without shifting everything to the state. The state is here as a guarantor for a very unlikely situation, but for the individual company, that can be killing. So therefore, giving this reassurance has been the main instrument to overcome this investment hesitation.
Right. I have to ask this question since I'm sitting in New York, and the question is this. One reason why the European Union has emerged as the de facto standard setter in this area globally is partly because the American administration has taken a very different policy. And although the American private sector has been very active in picking up many of the themes that you're championing as the climate bank, the federal action has gone in a different direction. How important is it to close a gap in governmental policy between the US and European Union? And are you hopeful that that will close in the coming years and perhaps make the task of international cooperation easier? And I'm not asking you to comment on the election, I'm talking about climate policy.
Well,
but feel free if you want to.
I would have an opinion though, but that's not the point. I really must say that I'm convinced that we will make globally much more and much faster progress if, in particular, Europe and the United States work together closely and march into the same direction, and of course together with other partners around the world. But the transatlantic link will be crucial. And by the way, I'm not that pessimistic about it, because we might be tempted to look a bit too much at the official American position right now. But if I look at the official American position expressed by many governors, many mayors, biggest part of industry, at the civil society, I'm very optimistic. I mean, people like Mike Bloomberg or Jared Brown are leading the way, and not others who are presently sitting in the administration. So I'm quite hopeful that we can cooperate with these actors like Bloomberg and Brown, also with others, let's say coming to solutions also together with the World Bank, which is of course an extremely important partner for us. So like initiatives like the Luxembourgish and German governments on the GAP Fund to support cities in the development world, on climate action projects there. So I think over time we will be able to reestablish a close cooperation also with the official federal US level, again, as we do it presently already with big parts of the private sector, the states and the local authorities.
Right. And just lastly, from a global perspective, we're almost out of time, but has the social crisis and the economic pain made the job much harder?
Well, of course, it is breathtaking and extremely saddening to see how many people are concretely suffering from the economic crisis triggered now again or reinforced by the COVID pandemic. However, we all must learn that the path towards sustainability and also social inclusion and path towards keeping our societies together will not work by trying to return to what we left 8 months ago, but build something new, build a more resilient, more green economy and technology for the future. And this works only by developing new technologies, by putting much more emphasis on research and development than we presently do in Europe and other places of the world as well. But Europe is particularly weak. We must strengthen our research and technology activities, development activities in this very field. Then this transformation is also a huge economic opportunity.
Right. Well, thank you very much indeed. Well, one of the key issues that has been focused on a lot is the question of the need for globalization and global participation. So thank you very much indeed, Dr. Hoyer, for your interesting remarks. We're now going to move into the second part of the program, looking at the question of multilateralism and globalization and global cooperation. But first, I'd like to hand over to the Master of Ceremonies, who's going to announce a short break.
Thank you, Dr. Hoyer, Jillian, and all the panelists for such an insightful address and discussion. We're about to begin a 15-minute break, but before we do so, I would like to remind you to visit our virtual library by clicking on the icon on the right side of your screen. Here you will be able to access several materials on the policy recommendations highlighted through the summit. And you can also continue following the conversation of our sessions on Twitter at B20, and also participate in the discussion by using the hashtag B20 Summit. Enjoy your break and see you in 15 minutes.
Hello and welcome back to everyone watching, and thanks for being with us today at the B20 Saudi Arabia Summit, Transforming for Inclusive Growth. If you've just joined, my name is Gillian Tett, and I'm going to be moderating the next section of this discussion, which is entitled Redesigning Multilateralism for a New Era. We're going to have a great panel join us in just a moment, and we'll be discussing the present and future of multilateralism and how it needs to evolve today in response to global dynamics and, in particular, COVID-19. But before we hear from the great panelists, we're going to start with a discussion framer coming from Mr. Gordon Brown, the United Nations Special Envoy for Global Education, and somebody who is a former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He led the UK at a pretty critical moment during the outbreak of the global financial crisis, and so he knows what it takes to handle a crisis, what goes right, what goes wrong, and what the key lessons are. So, to frame the discussion we're about to have, we will hear now from Mr. Gordon Brown.
The G20 of 2020, which convenes in a few days under Saudi chairmanship, needs to draw on, indeed to be guided, as at every G20 summit, by the wisdom, experience and on-the-ground knowledge of the business community. So I applaud this year's programme of work of the B20, to whose spring seminar I was privileged to contribute. Then we were focused on the stabilisation of the world economy and the rescue operations needed to prevent disease, financial instability, unemployment and poverty getting out of control. Then as now, we were clear that the economic crisis could not be solved without solving the health crisis. And then I said, and I repeat now, that we have to come together to collectively finance a globally accessible vaccine, cure and set of treatments, because COVID-19 will not be fully eradicated in any country until it is finally eradicated in every country. Then many said that in the absence of a vaccine or cure and in the knowledge that carriers of the disease do not often show visible symptoms, we need to make testing our first line of defense. And now that a saliva test with features similar to a pregnancy test, self-administered, relatively inexpensive, and with almost instant results, is soon to become available, there should be a million-fold increase in testing around the world, globally pooling and sharing such breakthroughs so that not only the wealthiest but also the poorest countries can control the disease. And if we accompany this by calling also for rapid tracking, testing, tracing, and when necessary, self-isolation, this breakthrough would also allow employees to go to work without fear, the geographically mobile to travel without heightened restrictions, and businesses to return to near full activity with only minimal disruption. Still, however, the one certainty facing our economies is uncertainty. And so I suggest 4 agenda items for the G20 that the business community, I believe, will want to support. First, now that we are thinking of recovery, the G20 needs to be active in coordinating fiscal and monetary policy. Even in emerging markets, all central banks, with few exceptions, have cut rates. Many have intervened in currency markets. About half have cut reserve requirements for banks, and 20 have launched QE with substantial asset purchases. Now we move from stabilization to recovery. Fiscal comes first. In 2009, China provided the largest fiscal stimulus. Today it is America, Japan, and Europe. But I want to stress that the cumulative benefits then from coordinating fiscal policies were twice what would have happened if countries simply acted on their own. That's the case for cooperation. And secondly, to bridge the fiscal gap in poorer countries, we have to extend to the end of 2021 and honour the promises we have made for multilateral, bilateral and private sector debt relief of around 80 billion, and where necessary to follow through case by case with debt restructuring, to enable these countries to spend on health, education, their social safety nets, and investment for recovery. And third, the G20 is the forum in which to agree, as we did in 2009, the issuing of new international money, the special drawing rights, 1.2 trillion, which can be delivered in 2 tranches, and under which the advanced economies can also transfer their SDRs to the poorest countries in greatest need. Now the world is at a crossroads, because first with higher tariffs, the building of walls, anti-immigration policies and protectionism generally, and now with an even more aggressive us versus them nationalism that subdivides the world into America first, China first, Russia first, India first, my tribe first silos, we look as if we cannot come together in responsible cooperation. Think of the way the world is organized and how it is changing. The old Washington consensus is not supported even in Washington, and not least because it cannot answer the challenges of trade opening, climate change, inequality, and the meeting of the world's sustainable development goals. But nor can any my country first nationalist rhetoric and protectionist approaches, which have led most recently to the vaccine nationalism, the restriction on health exports, and the abandonment of cooperation, even when all countries suffer from the same virus and the same recession. One of my predecessors as UK Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, talked in the protectionist 1930s of the results. A world, he said, that was resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, and all-powerful for impotence. Then, at the same time, the great economist Maynard Keynes said politics had become the survival of the unfittest. Others quoted the great British poet Shelley to say that politicians had lost the art of communication, but not, alas, the gift of speech. A future of one world, two systems won't either solve the global challenges we face. Instead, every decision would be made, as in the Cold War, in pursuit of their never-ending competition for advantage. And so the only way forward is the responsible cooperation that the G20 was formed to deliver and the B20 is dedicated to advance. A belief that even when we do not agree on many important issues, from human rights to the role of state in economic management, we must all come together to address these global problems that need global solutions that are only possible by globally coordinated actions. Financial stability, free and fair trade, climate change, imbalances, the restoration of growth itself, cybersecurity, nuclear non-proliferation, the management of the internet, and last but not least, the sustainable development goals to which every one of us is committed, but which without us acting together will move far beyond our reach of achieving. And so there is a fourth agenda item. We need to make our global institutions, the G20, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN itself, and even more urgently, perhaps the WTO, fit for purpose for the substantive cooperation and collaboration that we now need for our changing times. And we need an agenda, a timetable, and of course, a way of achieving this. The G20 was built around the idea that growth to be sustained has to be shared, and that the real enemy of each of us is not another country, but poverty, squalor, pollution, disease, chaos, war, and hopelessness. It is in our power to change this and give people what they need most of all, hope. And more aware than anyone of the damage that division can do, the business community should now, can now, and must now make your voice heard, your values count, and your vision of cooperation come alive across the world. Thank you very much.
Well, those were remarkably strong, rousing words from Gordon Brown. Thank you very much indeed. And as you point out, the world is at a crossroads. There's a desperate need for global coordination and cooperation that will require action from the international organizations. And yet the question is whether they are in the right position to do that role. And if not, what can be done to promote more cooperation going forward? So we have a terrific panel of people to talk about this right now from some of those international organizations that Mr. Brown just name-checked. First of all, let me welcome Her Excellency Dr. Sri Mulyani Indrawati, who is the Finance Minister of the Republic of Indonesia, who returned to that position in 2016 after serving as Managing Director and Chief Operating Officer of the World Bank. And she's also chaired the International Development Association of the World Bank's Fund for the Poorest Country. We've also got Dr. Kristalina Georgieva, who's a Managing Director of the IMF, who before she joined the IMF last year, she was the CEO of the World Bank. And before that, she played a critical role shaping policy in the European Union and the European Commission. We've got Dr. Makisa Kituyi, who's Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, who's got an extensive background as an academic. And prior to joining UNCTAD, he was also a government official. He was Kenya's Minister of Trade and Industry for 5 years. And we're also pleased to welcome Ambassador Roberto Azevedo, who is Chief Corporate Affairs Officer for PepsiCo and the former Director General of the World Trade Organization, who led the WTO from 2013 until just a few weeks ago. So thank you, everybody, for your time today. We've got a lot of things to talk about, but I'd like to start off with a question, which is this, and it very much touches on what Gordon Brown was talking. I'd like to ask you whether you think COVID-19 has revealed significant weaknesses in the international governance system, and what kind of reforms do you think we need to have to actually improve it? I'd like to start with you, with Kristalina Georgieva, because you wrote a piece recently calling for a new Bretton Woods, and I'm curious why you did that, and what do you think are the weaknesses that need to be addressed?
It is great to be with this group of people to discuss a topic that is very important for how we handle the pandemic, but also how we are going to cope with a more shock-prone world as a global community. The reason I spoke about a new Bretton Woods moment is because the founders of the Bretton Woods institutions of the IMF and the World Bank, in the midst of a war in 1944, got together to address two interrelated challenges: how to overcome the devastation from the war, and how to build a better world. And now, in the midst of the pandemic, we face pretty much the same: how to come out of this very challenging time, how to deal with the pandemic and its economic consequences, and how to use this as an opportunity to build a world that is greener, smarter, and a fairer world, more inclusive world. And that takes me straight to your question, where we are in terms of international cooperation. And I want to start from giving credit where credit is due. In this incredible crisis, in a shock like no other, we saw finance authorities and central banks acting in a synchronized manner with incredibly strong measures that have put a floor under the world economy and prevented a catastrophe wave of bankruptcies and massive unemployment. And they did it, why? Because of the formations like the G20, like the IMF governing bodies, other specialized institutions, where regularly there are interactions and there is a community being built. And the institutions created to act as first responders in a crisis, we also stepped in. The IMF has provided in a record short period of time support to 81 countries, virtually financial lifelines. And what is less known is that we zeroed our support to those countries that had no access to markets, where the liquidity provided by all these measures hasn't reached. 47 of the countries we helped are low-income countries. In Africa, we have done 10 times more than we would do in an average year. So if you draw a line, in the global financial crisis, in 2 years, there was indeed a massive mobilization and fiscal measures in place. In the short period of less than 9 months of this crisis, finance authorities have done twice as much as in the years of the global financial crisis, $12 trillion of fiscal measures, and central banks have poured some 7.5 billion of liquidity. So I'm saying this because we tend to not recognize enough that we could have been in catastrophe. We are not. This being said, are we in the best of places? No. We at the national level and a global level, there is a lot to be done to concentrate on preventing crisis. We know the big lesson is prevention is better than cure. And we have to build more of this, anticipate crisis, act early, target the most vulnerable. But above all, we need to honestly face the fact that millions of people are not supporting global cooperation because they feel they're not benefiting from it. They like take, trade, and I'm sure we would hear more about that. Trade, the evidence is clear: good for growth, good for jobs, good for poverty reduction, but bad for the millions that have seen their jobs evaporating with not enough attention to the fairness to everyone within countries and among countries. So if I'm to draw one lesson for all of us, it is to concentrate on why many people lost trust in multilateralism, and then make sure that we promote policies to restore this trust. And we at the fund take this to heart. I am delighted that the G20 is making that very important effort for the B20 to bring the business community, because we need business leaders, more and more of them, to step forward and think about a world, in an inclusive world in which we can build support for cooperation. The pandemic told us we are interdependent. We are in this together, and we can only get out of it together.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ms. Georgieva. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Katuyi and ask him for his thoughts about, what needs to be done to fix multilateralism. I think we can't hear you, Dr. Katuyi. I think the audio is not working.
It is now working.
Oh, yes, it is now working. Thank you. That's great.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much, everybody in this eminent panel. A number of things come through clearly. What the pandemic has done is to expose the fault lines and the frailties of multilateralism, and perhaps to a certain extent, the futility of the emphasis we've been putting so much on rebuilding to where we were. For a long time, those of us who have been in defense of multilateralism have tried to go back to how things were. And maybe the extreme conditions we see today are calling for us to pick the pieces, but to stitch together something that's different from the hard rules-based system that we have been struggling and yet seeing so much sliding away. Drifting away from defense of the old system, but now to looking to more consensus-based soft rule system instead of hard rules negotiated in perpetuity that have slowed down progress. There's a second thing, that for many of the developing countries, which were building industrial policy models around capturing a segment of global value chains, the dramatic fracturing of global value chains, which has been seeing the combination of economic nationalism, shortening supply networks, shortening global value chains, reshoring in industrial enterprises, it means that the opportunities for the old model are going away. And a new multilateralism will have to see a medley of strategies. For example, greater attention to growing domestic consumer base, greater attention to regional markets, new opportunities, particularly for South-South cooperation in a real way, and also to study the reality that the major enterprise investors are moving away from the model of heavy loaded infrastructure to infrastructure light investments. And that totally changes the notion of capital intensive infrastructure as the driver that is going to be delivering us to the new multilateralism. Most importantly, balancing between the pressures of economic nationalism, the possibilities of new technology, and the exigencies of more environmental responsibility, greening the production processes, calls for a totally new set of values, both for domestic application and for international engagement. that the multilateralism that we try to defend is going to be fundamentally different from the multilateralism that actually failed us in the first 5 years of the Agenda 2030. And now I have to start saying, how do we make up for lost time at times of limited resources and a competing attention to an economic pandemic without losing ground in social inclusion as the agenda going forward? I think these are the questions that will inform how to recover better and still make sense through a multilateral engagement. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Katuyi, for those very thoughtful remarks, which certainly, again, throw down the gauntlet to multilateral organizations and in many ways show, as you say, that we can't just return to where things were before and expect it to carry on. There needs to be much wider rethinking. But before that happens, we need to also address a question raised by Ms. Georgieva about the question of whether people still believe in multilateralism and whether wider public faith in that could and should be upheld. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Azevedo, to talk about that from the perspective of the trade policies, because we have seen a lurch back into trade protectionism. Can things be done to make people believe in the value of free trade and the multilateral organizations like the WTO?
Thank you very much, and it's great to be with everyone on this discussion, which I think is critical. I think what Kristalina mentioned earlier, the lack of trust in the multilateral institutions is very evident. It's quite there. And I think one of the reasons for that is that people don't feel that they own the system. There is no sense of ownership any longer to some extent. When the system was created back in the 40s, so after the Second World War, we knew very much what the challenges were, what we needed to address, and everybody was, feeling that the system was required, was needed. They owned the system, particularly at the core countries, and also everybody else. I think there was that sense. Now, I don't think that is the case today. And the general view is that the system is old, that it is antiquated, that it doesn't respond to realities at the local or regional level, that it tries to impose solutions on people. And there is a rejection of the system in general in societies. And this trend to reject what comes from outside comes from structural changes. It comes from structural changes in the economies. The labor markets are under pressure. People are losing jobs. They don't think that the system protects them. And the system means national governments and international organizations as well. Now, for that, we need to change the perception, the view that people have of the system. People need to understand the system as something that is trying to help them, that is trying to protect them, not to impose things on them. That's a different shape of mind. That you need more inclusiveness, more flexibility. Everybody has to be part of the conversation. Nobody can be excluded from this conversation. And I think that's the only way that we can move forward, is when people feel that they own the system and not they have to obey the system. And this is a big, big challenge for everyone at this point in time.
Right. Well, that leads very nicely into Dr. Muliani, who has both worked at a multilateral organization, but is now representing a country. And I'm curious, how do you think that something like the WTO can be made to feel as if it's representing the interests of its members, its countries like Indonesia? And, to what degree do you think you can strike the right balance between respecting a country's domestic priorities and protecting free and open markets?
Well, first, we are all recognize that the problem, especially related to this pandemic, but also climate change or even this digital disruption, this is not within border problem. This is a cross-border problem. So whether you like it or not, whether you are not trusting or you are trusting multilateral, you really have to address this issue through the global cooperation. because it's just impossible to solve it alone. That is the most important one. Now, what is lacking from this multilateralism? It's not only WTO, but the others. Usually we will look at all the elements. First, do they still have the firepower that they used to have? I mean, the client member country is becoming developed, whether from the low income to become middle income to become upper income. So whether they still have the financial power that they are having then quite an influence and power to influence through their financing power, because that's important. At the end, like multilateral development bank, like World Bank, IMF, they are financial institutions. WTO may be different because this is more like a regulatory, and how the policy that is perceived to be fair can be adopted across country, that create a fair chance for all countries to adopt a policy which is being seen that they are equally and evenly adopted. I think this is one of the most important of what you call it, the critical issue of their credibility. The second one is also the multilateral still have a very important, what you call it, convening power. Whether you don't like or you like those, they have the most efficient convening power. It is just very costly for a country to be actually then talking each other. Each country at the end, they are going to work regionally, like the ASEAN, in this case, Indonesia with the ASEAN, ASEAN 10, and then we expand it into ASEAN +3, and then we also reaching out to the IMF or World Bank or ADB. So this is just the mechanism which is the most efficient one. So not all the issue regarding perception, credibility, or in this case, ownership, as mentioned by previous speaker, I think has changed a lot. I mean, under many of the presidency and managing director, Kristalina now or Christine Lagarde before, or in this case in the World Bank, we have all the previous president until today, which they really sincerely want to listen to the membership. They actually have a totally different attitude. I've been following this multilateral institution, and I know I was the client, and then I joined the management, and then I'm becoming a client again. And I really see the difference in terms of the way the staff and management up to the top level on how they engage with the client country. I think we really have to appreciate that. Now the question, whether they can build based on this operating model, whether they can build a new credibility and trust. I think that is the most important one. And this is not just the multilateral problem, Gillian, because under the information system, which is very fast now with the IT technology, there are so many disinformation, misinformation, which is creating a distrust. So this has happened in one country, this has happened in the global level. So we are actually racing against how you are going to put the clear, good idea and credible one vis-a-vis the one who's just, their business is trying to disinform people. And that is really real. So I think within that context, multilateral institutions have to really change their operating model. Maybe the question about ownership or not imposing prescription, I think that is something which is too old, which is today, I think they are more open, democratic, engaging, and communicating in a more, I think, more partnership. And that is actually has been seen as the very, very effective one. I was in the management of the World Bank, and I know exactly that all the team doing just that. And of course, you cannot impose, because at the end, you're talking with the sovereign country. If you don't like the prescription or they don't believe in this prescription, it's fine, they are not going to follow. But then they are going to also then have their own situation, whether getting deteriorated or getting even worse. And that is exactly the dilemma for all these multilateral institutions within they are going to engage. Now, for the rule-based, like the WTO or, in this case, FSB, they are all need to feel that the country, in this case, situation or problem is very particular with the politics, need to be put within the perspective of what kind of mechanism that you can synchronize between the decision within one sovereign with the multilateral mechanism. For example, you mentioned about trade. Trade is the most classical when people technically, technocratically, you actually can give an evidence that trade is actually benefiting both sides. But if you ask politically, people will always perceive import is danger, export is good. And that is exactly the problem of how you are going to put what is actually technically and technocratically is actually evidence-based for 3 decades, how China becoming today, because they really like embracing globalization. They use the global trade so that they are really can reduce a lot of poverty. And many ASEAN countries really enjoying this trade and openness. But then if you ask politically, they will say that openness is not good. It's threatening.
Right.
Even the most competitive country, they always feel that way. So this is really beyond something which is related that, oh, okay, operating model. Maybe we really have to think very, very hard on how we are going to present the benefit of this multilateralism, or even in this case, to be very specific, globalization and trade system that can convince people that they are actually benefiting all parties. And this is exactly maybe the challenge. This is really the challenge. And I do hope the new WTO DG is going to take this one as one of the most important jobs, that is try to convince that trade is actually mutually benefiting all parties.
Well, that's certainly something which people are looking to the WTO to do. It will not be an easy job at all, as Ambassador Azevedo has pointed out. But I'd like to bring in Kristalina Georgieva at this point and just ask, you've essentially, Muliani has laid down the gauntlet very clearly for you. Why do you think it's so important to actually pick up multilateralism at the moment? And do you have confidence that support for it is going to grow in the coming years as opposed to keep declining?
The reason I am a firm believer of cooperation among nations and businesses and people is because our destiny depends on making that work. First, if you look at this crisis, who is the big winner? Big winner is digitalization. And for those that are saying, oh, we don't want to cooperate, it's a little too late, because the digital space brings us all together. Look at us today. We are in a very open world, and technology is going to continue to connect us, provided that we are mindful of the risks of this connectivity, cyber risks. Sri Muliani spoke about the risks of misinformation. But to take full advantage for everybody, we ought to pursue digitalization everywhere. Cannot be that it turns into yet another factor to open up the accordion of opportunities, for some a lot and for others none. And that calls very much for us working together, from technical standards to making sure that the operational modalities are there, and to make sure that everybody can access the internet and the opportunities of digitalization. Secondly, the risks. So the big opportunities for the economy of the future, the knowledge economy, they bring us together. But so do the risks. We don't like the pandemic. We sure are not going to like the climate shocks. And they are already with us. The climate crisis is not a hypothetical of some faraway future. And as Sri Muliani so clearly said, that we are in this one little planet together, very interdependent, cannot resolve it one country at a time, each for itself. Cannot be done. We need to cooperate, and frankly, we are pressed by time, because we are kind of slightly behind what needs to be done. The fact that we now see many coming on that commitment to net zero emissions is encouraging. Actually, we had the European Union stepping up, China stepping up net zero by 2060. Today is a great day for Asia. Japan made the commitment to net zero by 2050. We have to cooperate so technological advancements and the way we cope with this crisis make it possible to prevent a huge risk for ourselves, but especially for our children and grandchildren. And three, we actually do have the instruments. We have learned how to cooperate from the rules-based in agreeing on the rules of the game to financial institutions that make sure that those who don't have resources to do what is necessary can be supported. They can benefit from international solidarity, which is ethically right, but it is also in everybody's interest. And I do believe that we are going to be tested. International institutions do need to step forward. I liked very much what Dr. Kitui said in his intervention. We don't want to restore the world of yesterday. It wasn't a great world. We want to build the world on the basis of technology, of course, innovation and cooperation, a world that is more vibrant, more dynamic, and it is more sustainable and fair. I remember, Gillian, when I started and I'm sure Sri Mulyani would remember that, when I started a year ago, which by the way feels like decades ago, my first speech was about synchronized slowdown in the world economy, low productivity, low growth, high inequality, a climate crisis. These things have not gone away. And the question is, can we now, because we are more sober, this pandemic, it did touch us, each and every one. Can we, on that basis, renew a commitment to good policies and to working together? And I bring the Second World War because it was a horrible devastation for the world, but we did come out of it better. As Dr. Kitui put it, move forward, do better, because we now learn that if we don't work together, we are all worse off. And it is my conviction that people demand this from us. They may not know what multilateralism means exactly, but they know that they want us to work together to overcome risks and capture opportunities for better lives.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And of course, last year was the anniversary of the Bretton Woods. I actually went to the Bretton Woods Hotel, and it's very moving to see what they did indeed do back in World War II and to think about that. But I mean, throwing it forward, as Dr. Kitui says, and recognizing we can't go backwards, I'm curious, on the issue of climate change, what is the position of UNCTAD and what are your thoughts, Dr. Kitui? Because, you know, there's been a lot of complaint from the developing world that essentially the developing world is being asked to carry a lot of the burden, although they've not shared in the fruits of development in recent decades. So what are your thoughts from the perspective of UNCTAD? And again, I think you're actually on mute at the moment, so you need to press. Fantastic, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. There are two broad things. One links the climate issue and the global general environmental challenge. You see, although we are just looking at one side of the problems to multilateralism because of the pandemic, there's also another side that the pandemic has shown us how interdependent we are. Environment and climate change is one of the key links of our interdependence. For example, the crisis has shown us that environmental protection is an essential aspect of public health. And halting deforestation and wildlife trafficking is one of the routes to reduce the chances of zoonotic invasion virus like what we've had. And so that is one clear reality. There's a second reality about the fragility and limited resilience because of climate challenges. It is true that the developing world is the front line of the crisis of climate change. Those of us who have had the privilege to visit places like Vanuatu before and after a climate-related crisis, see how more than 90% of human capital investment in infrastructure can be wiped out in a number of days. So they bear the brunt of our collective sins when they have committed least of those sins. It is important that the conversation that we have about resilience and coming back stronger includes greening marine transport, building models of sustainable blue economies and green economies, strengthening the value and getting the right price for biotrade, and addressing the concerns of the most vulnerable maritime communities, particularly low-lying coastal communities, fisheries communities, and the victims of the environmental irresponsibility of the rest of the world. I think the climate challenge and the environmental connection to public health are two of the areas that keep telling us, in spite of the rise of economic nationalism, that we belong together and solutions can only be multilateral solutions.
Right, well, thank you. I'm curious because Ambassador Azevedo, it's come up several times that we have seen a loss of public trust and faith in multilateralism in relation to the trade agenda. I'm curious, if you look forward, what are the dangers of abandoning multilateralism with trade right now? And if you were a sort of betting man or putting probabilities, do you think when you look ahead 5 years that we're going to see more multilateralism on the trade front or more protectionism?
Hopefully we'll see more multilateralism, but I don't think that the geopolitical environment is going to change very much. Honestly, I think we're facing structural economic challenges. New technologies and new political trends feed off each other. There are more challenges today to the multilateral system than there were before, and those challenges are not going to go away. That's the reality. I understood what has been said before about international organizations being more responsive. I'm afraid that I don't see that as a horizontal reality. I see that happening in some international organizations who are understanding better, who are listening more. Others not so much. They're still stuck in their old ways. And I think that there are two things that you need to have at this point in time if you want to maintain the multilateral system active. The first one is you need more legitimacy, and legitimacy means listening, engaging. It's not only imposing because you can enforce, but dictating. This is what needs to be done. This is what, without listening, without having a proper dialogue and discussion before you begin to, issue opinions on what to do. And that, I have to tell you, is still very much the case in several multilateral organizations. I think they need to update. They need to update also not only in terms of process, but in terms of rules. The question there, Guilherme, is if the WTO, if the multilateral system cannot update itself, for example, we don't have rules today on electronic commerce. We don't have any rules whatsoever on an issue that is, look at us. We are in the digital age. What we're doing right now is something that is not under the rules of the WTO or any other rule, to be frankly, perfectly frank with you. So a system that doesn't respond to this new 21st century reality in terms of the economy, in terms of the politics, in terms of the institutions, it's going to go broke at some point in time. And if that happens, and that's a big risk, if that happens, you'll see a race to the bottom in very, very critical areas. Environment is one of them. You're going to see that in labor costs, labor rights. You're going to see that on food security. You're going to see that on border measures. And this can be a catastrophe for humanity as a whole. I don't think we can. It's so big that I don't think it's going to happen. I really don't. But that simply means that international organizations, the IMF, UNCTAD, WTO, and others, they need to get out of their comfort zones. And I know that they are. I know that they are. I know the job that Kristalina is doing and Kitui as well. I know that everybody's getting out of their comfort zone, but they need to get out more. And not only these, all of them, to make sure that we update and that we get the legitimacy that is needed for the multilateral system to be more effective.
Right, thank you. Well, I'd like to put the same question to you, Sri Mulyani, because you said earlier that some multilateral organizations are reforming, but I'm curious from your perspective, when you look ahead 5 years, do you think we're going to have more multilateralism or less? And to what degree do you think that is creating a frightening prospect amid this global recession?
Well, I'm optimistic it's going to be more of multilateralism. It's just that our country cannot afford to be alone or to actually handle the problem. First, post-COVID, many countries is going to have the fiscal burden, which is huge. For the low-income country, they definitely need this debt restructuring or support for them to be able to then back to their foot to start their development process again. For emerging country, they really have to win, or in this case, rearrange between fiscal monetary, because many of the extraordinary situations today requiring the role of the central bank, which is more step up into financing of the deficit, which is increased very dramatically. And that needs to be communicated very clearly, and this is the role of multilateral to signaling that for country who's doing this the right thing is actually okay. They are not abusing the independency of central bank or actually try to abuse the situation of this extraordinary by spending their fiscal policy in an irresponsible way. I think that's going to be very important for the multilateral institution to play that role. And also, as we are now entering this vaccine and post-pandemic, there will be also requiring a much more stronger cooperation. So, countries, like it or not, they are forced to work together. It's better that they are not forced. They voluntarily and they see it as a cooperation, which is seeing as a really mutual benefiting, because they don't have any other choice. The problem, the nature of global problem, is just requiring this kind of cooperation. So I'm more optimistic. It's just a matter of whether the country will be forced by situation, or we, in this case, actively build this new multilateralism, which is work for all of us. And I think the choice is for all of us. Within the G20, I think we discussed it, and many of the initiatives within the G20, whether you talk about the digital taxation, global taxation regime, I think that is really good. We feel that working within the multilateralism is really much better, much more efficient and more transparent to all parties. And then you talk about climate change. I think this is a classic example. You just cannot address yourself. After the France agreement, Paris agreement, I think all countries already make a pledge about how they are going to reduce the CO2 through their national determined commitment. This cannot be done alone. You cannot you cannot add up into this climate change commitment. So you really have to work together. And now we have this pandemic, which is also again showing that you cannot work alone. Because even if you make your country safe by vaccinate people and so on, you cannot just close your country. You are going to continue communicate, relate, and have this mobility of the people. So you cannot allow other countries not to have a vaccine and let them actually struggle, and then my country is going to be fine. That's not the way it's going to work, because it will not recover your economy. So I think, Gillian, I'm a more optimistic that multilateralism is going to be here to stay. It's just a matter of whether you really make this as a new mechanism that everybody can contribute, building it with a new spirit, or you just like forcing by the situation so that you are involuntarily, oh, okay, I have to work, I have to attend, and then that is not going to be an optimal choice, of course. I'm an Indonesia in this case, firm belief in cooperation, and that's why on a pandemic, we are working with the CEPI and Gavi for the vaccine, although we also actively try to invent ourselves as well as to get the access of the vaccine. And then on climate change, Indonesia commit to that and working together. On trade, we are hoping that the WTO is going to be restored. I think the problem in this case, Gillian, you really have to ask the biggest shareholder, who traditionally is the believer of the multilateralism. The biggest shareholder now actually still in a crossroad, asking whether they feel that multilateralism complementing their geopolitical interests, or this has become a burden. I think that is the most important one.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sri Mulyani, and you do indeed raise a big question, particularly for someone sitting like me in New York right now. But I would like to perhaps pick you up on your point about your optimism that multilateralism is indeed valuable and needed and will be here to stay, but of course does require a lot of actions and commitment from everybody watching. And I think that that is a very good last closing point to make, because we are sadly, very sadly, out of time. What the panel's shown is that everyone agrees that multilateralism is needed more than ever before, not least to deal with things like COVID and climate change. Everyone agrees, though, it's facing big challenges in terms of a potential loss of faith. And everyone also agrees that you cannot just use a model that was created in the past. Unfortunately, the economy is not like a laptop that you can just switch off and reboot when crisis happens and hope that it opens again in exactly the same way. There's going to need to be real reforms and changes. So this panel's laid out a lot of the challenges. Let's hope that people can now rise to the occasion and meet them. And in the meantime, I'd just like to say, on behalf of myself, a big thank you to everyone for taking part in this panel. It's been a real delight and pleasure to listen to these ideas, and very best of luck to all of you in actually putting them into action. And now I'd like to hand back to the Master of Ceremonies, and who's going to finish off this morning's or this afternoon or this evening's, depending on where you are, very interesting debate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As Jillian said, thank you all for being part of the discussion today. We welcome you to join us again tomorrow for the final day of the B20 Summit. We have another exciting agenda in store that will address the topics of energy, sustainability, trade, digitalization, and women in business, featuring global leaders. You can continue following the conversation of our sessions on Twitter at B20, and also participate in the discussion by using the hashtag B20 Summit. Please don't forget to explore the B20 virtual library so you can see exciting reports and videos. We hope to see you tomorrow, and you have my best regards. This was Mohamed Dakhil.